Welcome to Sharpe Insights, Conversations with your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Grant Miller, and today we're diving into what many believe is one of the most consequential financial and cultural shifts of our time, the Great Wealth Transfer. Over the next 20 to 30 years, baby boomers are expected to pass on significant assets to spouses, heirs, and even charities. So what role can plan giving programs play in helping this generation of donors shape meaningful legacies? And how should marketing strategies evolve to meet the unique needs, values, and communication styles of boomers and other generations? Today we're joined by Sharpe Group senior consultants Kristen Kroon, Julie Schuldner, Joe Chickey, and Sharpe Group General Counsel Barlow Mann. Barlow, let's start with you. What is the Great Wealth Transfer, and why does it matter for nonprofit organizations?
Grant, thanks for asking that question. It's a good place to start, the beginning. We're going to be talking about the modern Great Wealth Transfer. It's really something that's been going on for generations and millennium. It really began when people developed ownership of property, whether land or personal property, and they could leave title in some cases. In other cases, the real estate would be passed under the sovereign of that country. So all real property rights sprang from the king. But as people developed wealth through personal property, coins, silver, jewelry, cattle, chattel, those types of things, they had the ability to pass that on to their heirs. Now, let's jump up a couple of thousand years and get to the modern wealth transfer, which really began as a couple of academic studies. Originally back in 1990, an economist, Dr. Robert Avery at Cornell, was wondering what was going to happen to the baby boomers when they received a transfer of wealth from their parents and their grandparents. Would it ruin them? Would they stop working because of all this wealth they were going to receive? So he developed a model that was based on adults that were 18 and older that had children. And then actuarially, he followed that group and made some estimates about what would happen to wealth over time, and then tried to determine what that would mean to the baby boomers. Didn't include people without children. It was only actually those over the age of 50 with children 18 and older was the target group for that original study. But the numbers were mind-boggling. Billions and actually trillions of dollars were going to be transferred over potentially a 50-year period. There was also a 20-year panel that he studied. His study caught many people's attention, including the nonprofits, because he was anticipating roughly 14 or 15% of the wealth transfer would end up going to charities. After all, when someone passes away, where does their money go to? They can leave assets to their family, close friends, and charities. And normally, family comes first, and then the close friends and acquaintances and charities fall into a secondary category. This seemed to take on a life of its own, but it was an incomplete study. It was just one group. So the academic researchers at Boston College, led by Paul Schervish, decided he would create a new microsimulation model that would take everyone alive in America and project out their deaths over a 55-year period of time. And the figures were much larger. And the study was thoughtfully constructed with relatively conservative economic growth, and they used the census projected mortality tables. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? Well, it turns out that 55 years is a very long time. And the Boston College study that started following the wealth transfer in the year 2000 got off to a very slow start. There were economic challenges, recessions. It turns out that the census mortality projections were way off. And we had basically cases where from one year to the next, instead of more people dying, fewer people died. And deaths were stuck in the 2.4 million to 2.5 million period for almost 15 years before they finally started to increase. They really took off when COVID hit, and now they've slid back slightly, but we've moved from around 2.4 to 2.5 million to more than 3 million deaths per year. That number will be growing dramatically as the baby boom generation ages out and begins to transfer assets to their families, their friends, and their charities. So that's basically the beginning. And where we are today is the academics are out of this. The last study was 25 years ago, Boston College. But since then, a number of consulting firms have picked up those original numbers, and they've simply looked at household wealth and other mortality assumptions, and the numbers have gotten bigger and bigger. Slightly over a year ago, the December issue of Forbes magazine projected a $100 trillion wealth transfer. Since then, other consulting companies have seen much, much larger numbers, and the current number is $124 trillion. Now, regardless of how much money is going to be passed from one generation to another, it's going to be a lot of money. In fact, historically, if you take any 10 or 20-year period, it's been a lot of money. So that's the background where we are today and where we'll be going over the next several time periods. There's a near term, the next, say, 5 years, the next 10 years, and then the next 20 to 30 years. And each one will be a little bit different, and it will impact generations quite a bit differently.
Thanks, Barlow. That is an excellent explanation of this seemingly convoluted and always shifting topic. And I also always appreciate some historical context whenever we're talking about these topics. It's very helpful. And I'll just open up this question to the consultants. What types of assets are going to be transferred through this great wealth transfer, and how should nonprofits strategize accordingly?
So, Grant, this is Joe. I'm happy to begin that conversation. So as we look at the wealth that's been accumulated over the years, of course, a lot of that wealth has not been cash that they hold. It's been what they own. So that would mean real estate, as Barlow's talked about. That could mean cryptocurrency, but the most common ways are going to be gifts of appreciated assets, such as stock that's publicly traded, or certainly there could be all kinds of tangible personal property. There could be artwork. There could be cryptocurrency. There are lots of different things. So one of the challenges and one of the things we spend a lot of time with our clients helping them understand is they need to listen for cues from their clients to find out, well, do you own a business, and what kind of business is that? Lots of opportunities with closely held businesses now. So there's just a wonderful array of possibilities. And as the economy grows and continues to be successful, to engage these people in the amazing work that they're doing in this nonprofit sector, and for them to then have these conversations about how there's some really smart ways they can give some of these appreciated assets.
Grant, I'll just jump in with a couple follow-up comments. I agree with Joe. We are going to see a pretty wide array of non-cash assets, which are going to be part of this wealth transfer. And I think it's key for our development staff to cross-train everybody across the department. So it's not just your plan giving staff that are listening for cues, but all of your staff are able to identify these non-cash assets and have a basic understanding of some of these complex gifts. I think it's also going to be important to build relationships with your donors' financial advisors, their estate planners, and so that those individuals, when they're working with their clients, can perhaps talk about your nonprofit if indeed those clients are interested in including a charitable gift within their estate plans.
I would continue to add from what Julie has said that in addition to training your staff, this is an excellent time to really dig into your gift acceptance policies and make sure that your organization has addressed what they will accept and what the procedure for accepting those assets would be. Because as we know, people give what they have, and it's not always just publicly traded securities. So we need to be prepared to accept maybe some not so typical gifts.
So be prepared and make sure all your ducks are in a row there. So values change from generation to generation, whether moral, cultural, or philanthropic. What are boomers' philanthropic values, and how might they differ from previous and subsequent generations?
I'll hop in with part of that being part of the baby boom generation. Each generational cohort grow up at a time and they have some common experiences. Not every boomer is exactly the same, and sometimes their experiences are different. For example, the leading edge of the boomers, the older half, they grew up during the late 50s, 60s, and that's what formed their lives. Those that were born in the 60s really don't have memories of JFK or the moon landing. They had a different experience. But collectively, there are many things that each successive generation are exposed to, whether it's the silent generation, which was a small generation born in the aftermath of the Great Depression, or the GI generation that literally changed the world. And the generation that followed the boomers, the so-called baby bust, had a different experience, as did the millennials. Each individual is truly an individual, but collectively, each generation, opinions and values are formed by the world around them. The baby boomers grew up during a turbulent time in the 1960s and 70s, and it's amazing the anti-war movement and social movements in America, they were very vocal about the need for change. Back then, Robert Sharpe would say that they had a big mouth and big ideas, but they didn't have a lot of money. Well, now the baby boomer generation is the wealthiest generation ever. And those assets have to go someplace. They'll either spend them while they're alive, or they're going to pass whatever remains, again, to friends, family, and charities. And I will say my older brother was very active in the anti-war movement, but it was anti-war. It wasn't anti-soldier. So I was amazed to see late in life the charities that he was adopting were oftentimes to serve veterans. And that was kind of an interesting change. And again, it spoke to his values. It really related back to his earlier values, but it was reflected in a way I did not expect.
I think a study of the generations is so interesting. Growing up, I don't recall the associated terminology being as widely used as it is now. I feel like we're constantly talking about, well, they're a millennial or they're Gen Z, and just associating different values and habits with the generation. So I think it's interesting to look at not only in terms of your donors, but also in terms of your colleagues and identifying why you do things, how you do things in terms of what generation you identify with. But I think it's important to understand that there are different values associated with the generations, different interests in terms of who you want to support as a charitable interest, and also how you want to communicate with these individuals. I think our older generations still enjoy our print publications, whereas some of our younger generations are more interested in getting all of their information via text message, for example. So very important to identify who you're speaking with in terms of your donors and what you want to say and how you want to say it.
Well, let me just add, I think the other thing to think about is, as Barlow pointed out, we've got a pretty wide age gap here with the boomers. Some of those were born in the late 40s and some of those were born in the early 60s, the oldest now in their late 70s. So there is a difference, I think, in some of their behavior and some of their philanthropic interests based on sort of when they grew up and which decade was more meaningful to them. That's all really important to understand. Let's talk just a minute about the financial side of this. So one of the statistics that's fascinating to me that we've been sharing with some of our clients is the majority of closely held businesses in our country are owned by baby boomers. And we haven't talked a lot about closely held businesses and the opportunities to use that asset for giving. And it could be as simple as setting up a donor advised fund, or it could be gifting the securities outright to one of the charities they're passionate about. Or we could also, we've even had success with a number of clients recently over the past 5 or 6 years, as they're selling these businesses, they can be a wonderful asset to transition to a charitable remainder unitrust so they can provide an income for the husband and wife or the couple when they retire. So one of the other challenges to look at, though, if you look at some of the boomers that are probably in their early to mid 60s now, some of them still may be taking care of elderly parents and have kids in college. So, you've got kind of both sides to look at. So it's important to understand where they are in their life cycle. We find so many times that donors really don't think about their legacy, in particular, think about including a charity in their legacy until late in life. One of the interesting statistics from Russell James, as many of you are familiar with, the professor at Texas Tech, who's been doing all this great research on talking with people about what are they going to do about their legacy and are they going to include a charity. And one of the things that he's learned as he gathers this data over a window of time is the majority of people who have named a charity in their last will have not named any charity in their second to last will. So that really gives us pause. There's a lot of data now and a lot of success with getting people to raise their hands at an early age, which is wonderful. They're also really committed to us and making gifts, but it's so important to build these relationships and maintain them through their 80s, even into their 90s now. And that's going to be true with the boomers too. They're still kind of a little bit young for some of these traditional bequest gifts. So how do we engage them? They're perfect age now for us to talk to them about charitable remainder unit trust. The most common age there is 67 or 68. And certainly the older ones are now really good prospects for charitable gift annuity. So again, just looking at the whole picture and figuring out how we can be most successful. That's what we continue to do in our teaching and coaching and mentoring for our clients.
I'll follow up with that. And Joe makes an excellent point, which is that people are making those ultimate outright gifts very late in life. It's really important internally, in addition to having the good gift acceptance policies. This might be an excellent time to really focus on your legacy society and not just spreading the message about deferred gifts, but those that have named you, have told you that they've named you in their will, keeping them engaged and using them as examples, telling their stories to keep your organization, frankly, in the will. And regular personal updates to those older people. We know that as people age, their social circle really diminishes, and it's important to continue to stay engaged on a personal level.
Thanks, Kristen. I want to follow up both with Julie and Joe. Julie, you mentioned some of the different marketing strategies for the different generations. And Joe always tells a story about a gentleman who was trying to give away a farm, and he walked into a development office with a newsletter in his back pocket, and he held it out to the development officer, and he pointed to a picture on the back and said, "I want to talk to this person." And subsequent generations, especially millennials and Gen Z, they might be less interested in walking into a development office with a piece of paper, more interested in communicating via social media, receiving information via social media or through text messages. And boomers seem to be kind of in the middle of these two phenomenons. Boomers are using email. They're sending text messages. My dad loved watching YouTube and sending me emails about things that he discovered there. So what are some really good marketing strategies for boomers that can incorporate their interstitial position between these generations?
It's so interesting, Grant, because my parents are in their mid-80s, and while they do enjoy texting and they are on email and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, they still read the New York Times cover to cover every day. And so I think they're not alone. And that being said, our newsletters that we offer are really the best way to communicate with that group, especially if you have the budget to send 2 to 4 a year. So you're keeping up to date with what's going on and communicating a variety of information to that group. And so I think that's super important. On top of that, using the storytelling, the donor story, and using that social proof with your donors so they could see what other people are doing, how other people are giving, the impact that they're making, how they're giving, what type of giving vehicle. And so I think combining that with some of the more detailed information about these giving vehicles is a great way to communicate with these older donors.
And Julie, you and I work for one of the biggest organizations in the country, and they recently did a survey, and they obviously communicate with people of all generations. And I believe the survey came back and said that most people do still prefer print publications. Is that right?
Definitely. There's so much of our communication does take place now on a digital level that I think it's refreshing to get some of your information in print. I mean, personally, and I'll identify as a Gen Xer, personally, I still like to get my book out of the library and hold a real book. And so I think when somebody does take the time to send me information in terms of in a newsletter format or a brochure format, I'm definitely going to take the time to read it and hold on to that if it's something that really resonates with me.
One thing about a planned gift, and we as fundraising professionals all happen to know this, is that we cannot control the timing. We can only have the message in front of the donor when they are ready. And most people, they don't go to see their attorney every 6 months. It's a once every 3-5 years sort of thing. So often people will have a folder or they're holding physical materials to take with them to their attorney's office. I don't foresee somebody having a saved mailbox in their email that says, in case I go to my attorney, these are the things I want to bring up. These larger financial decisions are made primarily based on paper information.
Yeah, I mean, I have junk mail from Capital One Bank that sits around longer than any social media reel or email, or, they just kind of come in and they go away as quick as they come in. So even just having a physical object laying around that, unless you recycle it, you can't really forget it's there. And it's always kind of sitting there as a reminder to consider your legacy.
Well, let me just add too, I think ideally what we want to be able to learn is what is the donor's preference? How would they like to be communicated with? Whether that's a printed piece or electronic or whatever that may be. So ideally, we can identify that. Now, I think all of our data would suggest, and the success of our clients would certainly suggest, that the printed piece and one that has some stories in it is typically the most successful. I think we want to continue to communicate and educate both our clients and our donors about some of the simple ways that they can make these gifts and some of the smart ways that they can make these gifts, right? So whether it's a simple gift of securities or whether it's a beneficiary designation. And of course, we've seen so much success now with retirement plan giving, as I think most everyone knows now. Once you turn 70 and a half, you can give money out of your IRA and not pay taxes on it. And we've seen significant growth in that space. And simple beneficiary designations. Actually, I was working with a client this last week in Chicago, and they just received a gift from a donor, and he left them as the beneficiary of his investment account. And it was several $100,000. That's the only thing you left them, though. So again, seeing all this wealth and where the opportunities are and learning from your interactions with these donors, the best way to communicate these possibilities, sharing these ideas, getting them excited about what your organization is doing for them and for the world. That passion is so important. The financial aspects are an added bonus, as we talked about, or sort of icing on the cake. But finding the best way to communicate these ideas to them in a way that they like and understand. And it, as Kristen points out, it may be quite some time before they actually meet with their estate planning attorney and go through the process of making a bequest to charity. But they could certainly, if they have a 401k or an IRA, it's easy for them to go online. Most of them, even those that are older, know how to do this and print off the form and check a box. I'm going to leave 10% to the American Cancer Society are pretty simple things to do. So helping them understand those simple answers, simple possibilities, that can make a significant impact.
Thanks, Joe. Can you estimate how many times in one's life they might create and or revise a will?
So that's a good question. I think it sort of depends on the wealth of the individual, how long they live. Those are factors, of course, but it's not uncommon. We typically see the first time someone does a will, in particular if they have children, is they're concerned about guardianship. So they may do that first will in their late 20s into their early to mid 30s. And then they could certainly, and this is really data more from Dr. Russell James, I think typically we see 4, 5, 6 times. It's not uncommon for wills to be updated. And of course, the big message there is you want to make sure you're in which will? The last one. The last one's the only one that counts. Our data, and this is really important data that we at Sharpe Group have developed over the years when we looked at thousands of estates over the years and when someone passed away and when they wrote that last will. And it would surprise some people to know that that last will is typically most commonly done just 3 or 4 years before they pass away. So again, if they're passing away in their mid to late 80s, that last will is being done in their early to mid 80s. So it's so important to be in contact with them and have a good relationship so that you're top of mind when they make that final decision.
So the wills that millennials and Gen Z, they're giving cash gifts here and there to organizations that they care about. But the wills that they create at 25, 30, 35, 40 are not going to be most likely the last wills.
Yeah, exactly. exactly right. Now, let me add this point, though, that if they're raising their hand at that young age and naming you as a member of their will, then they're very meaningful to you. As we talked about Robert Sharpe Sr., that was his big message. Who do people name in their wills? They name their family first, right? But maybe, just maybe, there's a charity they're so passionate about, they'll name you in their will. So naming them even young can still be meaningful. It likely, if you cultivate and steward them, and this is more Dr. James' research, then those annual gifts will grow over time as long as you steward and cultivate them. Now, their legacy gift may or may not ever happen, but their legacy gift, if you build that really strong relationship, and this makes common sense too, if you can identify them, if they raise their hand and have a chance to steward and cultivate them over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, guess what? That's going to be a more meaningful gift too. So I'm not saying disregard those young estate commitments, but just understanding that if you're really looking to grow your plain giving program and your realized estate gifts, then that piece is not part of the puzzle that's going to be part of your success. And if you're really looking to grow your overall fundraising program by working with individuals, the ultimate gift is the one that's the biggest, right? And with this huge wealth transfer happening now, and that's our big message today, there's a window of opportunity in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years that we've never seen in our country. And if you're not talking to them about their annual gift, their special gift, and their legacy gift on a regular basis, you got to ask them for all three of those. And the third one is the one that's going to be the most meaningful. Maybe you won't be around long enough to see it, but it's going to be the most meaningful for the charity.
At the beginning of COVID, my wife pushed me to create a will. And even now, 4 years later, I probably couldn't even find the thing if I wanted to. And the circumstances of my life have changed over 2 or 3 times since then. So I'll have to get back on that and write a new one here soon. So what are the biggest implications of the Great Wealth Transfer for plain giving programs?
Grant, I'll add to that when it was all first reported, they really made it seem like there was just going to be this huge wave and all plan giving departments would just be so busy for about 10 or 15 years. And what we're seeing is that it's not quite as concentrated as originally put out. As we know, women live longer. A lot of these assets will be going to the spouse. And then many times the spouse could have ultimate say about the disposition of the assets. So it's a little bit more complex than a big turnover. It's also important to really try to involve Julie mentioned earlier, the advisors and be a partner with the family in those decision-making moments, and also including the children. If you can involve the children and other family early, at the very least, you will avoid upset at the person's demise, but also you may all be building the next generation of supporters for your organization.
I think you also need to make it known that these are gifts that you are ready and able to receive. And so, for instance, I look at a lot of websites and I'll go to the donate page and the only option on there is a cash gift by check or credit card. And I think that is an opportunity to say, I'd like to give a gift through my donor advised fund, or I'm interested in making a gift of appreciated stock. It doesn't need to be just living on a separate page, but also on that donate page. So getting people thinking about giving in other ways, getting them out of the habit of just throwing something on their credit card or sending you a check, because most likely they do have these assets. They're just not used to giving to you that way. And so changing that behavior is vital.
Julie makes a really great point. We start talking about giving from your assets and not giving from your disposable income. And it's really easy for people to give cash. I'll share another quick story. I met with a donor in Chicago recently. He's in his early 80s, and he was giving between $20,000 and $30,000 a year in cash to several different charities. And we had a meeting with him, and I said, do you own anything that's appreciated in value over the years? And he goes, well, yeah, I have one of those brokerage accounts with A.G. Edwards, and there's a nice guy there. He's done well for me. And I said, well, have you considered giving that instead of the cash? He goes, no, cash is just easier. And so it's part of the education, right? We make an assumption as a fundraiser. Everybody knows how to give appreciated stock. It's really simple. Just transfer it, right? We know as the people get older, cash doesn't make up much of their wealth, right? In particular, as their wealth grows, we look at so much money in these closely held businesses. And of course, the real estate value, their home value itself, that's where the wealth is. Until you can have some of those conversations about their wealth and even just start getting them to give appreciated appreciated stock. That's sort of part one. Then you can really have meaningful conversations about what a difference this can make. And I guess I'll just add one comment too. And I know we've talked a lot about this wealth transfer, and Barlow's done all this fantastic research to share some of these numbers. But the one that I share with boards most often is if you look at USA Giving in 1982, it was about $4 billion that was being given through traditional bequests to charities. And last year was $45 billion. So if you just look at that number, roughly $50 billion over the next 10 years, that's $500 billion that's going to be given away. And that's assuming no growth. So if you don't think this is happening now, that should illustrate to you this is a window of opportunity, and you need to be talking. Your board needs to understand this. Your leadership needs to understand this, and you need to spend the time and money and resources to benefit from this.
Joe, that's a great opening, too, to go back to. We've been talking a lot about the generations. How do you know what generation somebody's in? That's the data you need. Some people, it's all stage of life. They're younger, middle-aged, or older, and now that information is available. You may have the information on file, but maybe the last time you did an age overlay was 10 years ago. You may find that you only have data on half your file, so it's something you need to keep up with. In addition to age, that gives you a great way to roughly put people into the right generations. But you can also look at things like income estimates and wealth estimates, so you can figure out who the more affluent people are that are more likely to have diverse assets, or who's going to be able to fund a separate charitable remainder trust. They typically are going to have above the median wealth level. So combining those things, making sure your data is up to date, will help you reach the right generations at the right time in their lives. For example, the IRA QCD, they have to be at a certain age even to do it on a tax-free basis. You can dial in. Not every plan giving mailing has to go to everybody, so you can save money. And another way to save money is maybe to clean your list up and make sure you're not mailing to people who passed away 3 years ago. And that's an expensive proposition if you're mailing 17 times a year to everyone on your list.
So we need to know which of our donors are in which generation. All right, Kristen, you mentioned earlier that in order for plan giving organizations to be really prepared for this transfer, they need to have all their processes in place, make sure everyone's on the same page, and continue to steward donors, obviously. I'll also open this up to the group. Can each of you provide nonprofit organizations out there with a couple of pieces of sound advice just for how to be prepared for this great wealth transfer?
Thanks, Grant. One of the first things I would do, because the direction of a nonprofit is determined by its board. So I think the very first order of business is to inform your board and ensure that they understand why the allocation of present resources for future income is so critically important now within the next 20 years. It's difficult for many board members to look that way because their terms are usually 3, maybe 5 years. And so they won't see the benefit of that investment. So I would absolutely start with informing your board members. And then also they will be able to be better listeners and better fundraisers for your organizations themselves.
So ensure everybody in your organization knows that plan giving isn't a short-term game.
Yes.
It's a long-term strategy.
And the longer you wait, the less you'll receive. So you have to have your name in the hat if you're going to have the donor pull it out of the hat. And that's something that you need to proactively do on an annual basis, because as Joe, Kristen, and Julie have all pointed out, your donors are acting on their timetable on the estate planning. And if you're not there when they're planning their estate, you may simply be overlooked, even though they've been a regular contributor for many years.
So don't just plant the seed, and then plant the seed again, and then plant the seed again.
True.
I think one of the important ways to do that is to personalize the outreach. And in order to personalize the outreach, you need to segment your donors. So it's important to have accurate, up-to-date information about all of your donors in your database, full name, address, and then details. Append that important data at least on an annual basis. And so what I mean by that is what is their income? What's what's their net worth, what's their age, anything. There's 4,000 different data points that you could append to your data, and it allows you to personalize your communication. And then you can segment your database by these generations or by other attributes, how frequently people give, how long they've been giving, what programs they're giving to. And that's all important because you don't just want to design general direct mail and send it out in the hopes of getting a gift. You want it to be personal so that your donors know that you're speaking to them through direct mail, but it's personalized for their needs and their interests.
And Grant, I would just add, in addition, one of the things we do as a firm, we have what we call the Sharpe holistic approach. And we spend time looking at every aspect, starting with understanding your donors, then identifying the right comprehensive plan for you, and then, of course, helping make sure that you're stewarding these people, thanking them consistently over a window of time. And then, and this is a really important piece too, is creating some sort of a metric and a measurement so you can determine and share with your leadership. Kristen talked about how critical it is to get leadership on board and for them to understand what this window of opportunity is and how they can be successful. Historically, we've looked at realized bequest and money coming in the door. That's how you know you're being successful. And that's clearly a really important metric. But the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners has created a new model of standards. There are actually 16 standards. It's one of the things we also, an exercise we go through with our clients. So helping them put all these pieces together, as we talked about, a customized program for each charity and each client, and going through all of these different pieces is critically important for them to have long-term success.
Wow, this is all excellent advice for organizations as we all prepare for this transfer. Barlow, I wanted to say thanks so much for that early history of the Great Wealth Transfer. That was very elucidating. Kristen, Julie, and Joe, thanks again for your expertise. I've learned a lot from this conversation, and I'm sure that our listeners have too. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.